It's an honor to be here. I had a bit of a philosophical problem coming here because my shtick for the last few years has been to try to be forward-looking, and they even labeled my talk Future of the Web. But at the same time, I also found out that I have no predictive power at all. In the last year, it's just been blow after blow, surprise after surprise. I don't feel like I know what's going on. So I have decided instead to reach into the past, hoping that reasoning by analogy, we can still pull some insights, the stuff that you paid the good money for at this conference, but on firmer ground than we had before. And I want to focus my efforts on internet explanation today on the book of Ecclesiastes. Has anybody read this thing? It's in the Bible, but it's kind of tucked away. Ecclesiastes is a very strange text. It's basically a grumpy old atheist living like 2,000 years ago who thinks life has no meaning, there is no God, and for some reason he wrote it all down and they put all this stuff in the Bible. It's kind of a spiritual brother of my Twitter feed, so I'm very, very happy to have this ancient text to lean on. And Ecclesiastes has a lot to say about technology today. For example, this is a quote about JavaScript. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. But the main quote that inspired this talk for me is that what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was here already, long ago. It was here before our time. I have to start, as it's a front-end conference, before I get into the main legend I want to talk about, discussing the elephant in the room, which is the curse that has descended upon all of you in the last couple of years that I've observed with horror from afar. And that's, of course, the curse of complexity. I'm sure many of you have seen this chart in its many incarnations. This was meant to be a friendly intro. When you want to get started with front-end development, here's the 97 technologies and frameworks you should master to begin to get your footing in this exciting new field. This is a curse that descends once every generation upon our industry, and it picks different people each time. Since computers move fast, once every generation means about every 2 years or so. So one thing I want to say is take heart. It's happened to other people. You'll get through it as well. This is something called korba. Please don't confuse it with shorba, which is a delicious soup. Korba is something, I think it's called the Common Object Request Broker. There's a lot of words in there. All of these ancient curses happen when you speak a sentence so evil that the gods take note and smite you. So what the korba people said was, what if there was no difference in doing a procedure call locally or across the network? And that sinful sentence brought them this massive complexity that they've been struggling with ever since. They've since turned into those Java for Enterprise people that walk around with the hollow eyes. We had this happen in the web with XML and the semantic web. It's a giant monitor, but I still can't read any of these. These are all W3C specifications for XML standards for web services. Somebody has to learn this and master this. Thankfully, it's not me. There's also a more like intellectual, highfalutin version of this, which is called the semantic web. It's one of my favorite diagrams because it has things in it that are really heavy, like trust. Like, I don't ever want to work on a tech project that has a trust layer. I don't have that confidence in my capabilities. And it also has this lubricating strip of cryptography on the side that's supposed to just kind of take care of everything. But the best thing about the semantic web diagram is that I'm not even showing you the very top layer, which is user interface and applications. So before you can build anything in this world of abstraction, you need ontologies, whatever those are, you need Sparkle, you need trust, proof, cryptography, and then finally you can build something that a user might come into contact with. This curse hit hard. The sin of the XML people was to say, what if we structured all data like a document? And they were beset. And you saw this happen to your colleagues in the back-end systems just a couple of years ago. They said, what about virtual machines? And then a dark cloud descended and picked them up, and they have not been seen since. So complexity is this curse. And as an outsider, I have a few comments to make that might not be well received. I apologize in advance if I hurt feelings, but I think that there's a couple of pathologies I can point out. One is simply that things are really, really bloated. This is an article that appeared, I think, last week by Googlers, and it's all about ideas for efficient loading on the web. Does anybody know how, and this is pretty much 90% of what was on the page. There's like 3 little images. Anybody know how big this page was? It's a Medium post, if that gives anything away, so that automatically means 1 megabyte. So it's like 1.1 megabytes just to say how to load stuff quickly on the web. I feel like standards have slipped, and the way we measure our web performance is not the same as the way we do measurements in any other area of software. Like, it's normal on the web that things are as fast now as they were 10 years ago, that it hasn't gotten markedly better. It's normal to have 1 megabyte lumps of stuff that come down, or hundreds and hundreds of web requests on a page. I think this is one place where advertising has hurt, because it sets these norms for lots of requests, lots of size, that it's okay to render within 1 or 2 seconds rather than instantaneously. Second critique I have comes as a guy who runs a bookmarking site, which tries to archive the many things you build. They're beautiful, wonderful cathedrals of code made with all the latest frameworks, and if I don't have the exact runtime, and if I can't get it all at the time I crawl it, it's gone forever. I know you all value your tools greatly, so I want to make sure that when you build this stuff, you build it to last more than a month or 2. You build it for keeps. Part of archiving is making sure that I don't have to follow a forest of dependencies, that web-like things behave like the web. And really, most of the web is just text pages that are a little bit decorated. And my final heresy is against something called the inner platform effect. This is a fascinating thing that happens in systems when they become too fast and too good for their own good. We complained for years and years that JavaScript wasn't fast enough, that it was too quirky, that the browser couldn't do like real graphics and things like that. And people actually fixed it. The browsers got fast enough and good enough that we can now rewrite all of the browser in JavaScript. We can make a rendering engine, we can go make network requests, do all of the things that it's the browser's job to do, but write it ourselves, badly implemented inside the browser in JavaScript. So the inter-platform effect happens when you recreate the environment you're working in using the tools of that environment. And you can do this multiple times with decreasingly happy effects. Ultimately, what it boils down to is I think people caught app fever. I was trying to remember the last time I actually downloaded an app, but a while ago it seemed like apps were going to be the rage. You couldn't go to a web page without being redirected to a special custom app that was written for it, and web developers just went crazy. Everything had to be app-like. You had to be able to do a parallax effect in the browser if you could do it on your mobile phone. You had to be able to do weird things when you scrolled. You had to have the rubber band effects, all this stuff, which somehow miraculously you did. I have no idea. I can barely attach an event handler to a node, and you guys are doing stuff that is sorcery, but it's really brittle and bloated sorcery. And I think it's okay for this stuff not to be app-like. I've heard it said that users kind of demand this beauty and finish, but what users haven't seen in a really long time is very, very snappy websites. And I think if you built one as an experiment, you would be surprised at the results. Speaking as someone who built a snappy bookmarking website and stole everybody's lunch that way. That's it for my rant that's going to antagonize all of you. Now I want to talk about a legend of the deep web, the far-off web. To quote Ecclesiastes again, there is no remembrance of the former generations, neither shall there be any remembrance of the latter generations. That means you that are to come among those that shall come after. So basically, anything we talk about at this conference is futile because our wisdom will be forgotten. But that's okay, because we're here now and we're going to learn about the web that came before the web. I was surprised when I was preparing this talk. I kind of had a bunch of things in mind that I wanted to present to you, but I got sucked into the history of radio. And the early history of radio has an amazing resemblance to the early history of the web, to the point where it kind of spooks me because the things that happened with radio and the ways it was put to use later in its life have ominous implications for us who work on the internet. But if you didn't know that radio existed, the whole thing sounds kind of like a scam. There are these magical invisible rays that go from place to place, and they go through walls in people's bodies, but you can communicate with them if you set up this occult pattern of metal. And it sounds fishy, but of course we know that it works. It was predicted in 1864 by James Clerk Maxwell. It kind of fell out of the equations of electromagnetism. He showed that you could have this oscillating electric field and it would have a little oscillating magnetic field, and the two would kind of push each other and they would go off at the speed of light. But it wasn't until 1886 that Hertz actually detected this stuff and proved that it had a physical meaning as well. And it took a further 9 years after that for Marconi to build the first practical radio set. This is we call it a radio, but it's really a wireless telegraph. At the time, all you could do was make these things go bzz, bzz, and it had a very short range. There was no amplification. So the wireless telegraph was kind of a novelty, but it didn't immediately scream to you, this is a brand new thing that's going to change the entire universe. Just like the internet, radio technology fell into an environment that was ready for it and kind of expecting it. The telegraph had been around for a long time already. The phone had been around, and not only were they around, but there were also these communities of enthusiasts, hackers we'd call them, who were really into building their own little 10-node telegraph system. There were all these tiny phone companies in the American Midwest that would run phone cables through barbed wire on farms. Farmers before mass media were the most bored people on the planet, so they would just talk to each other all day when they could over their barbed wire fences on their phones. So this wireless edition seemed like a cool new toy to play with. And it wasn't at all clear that it was going to go anywhere. It wasn't clear that you could transmit stuff at any distance or that you could ever transmit the human voice instead of just buzzing Morse code. So the first radio sets used this spark gap. You see the spinny wheel up top. People communicated in Morse code, and this is kind of, if you remember that New Yorker cartoon that made the rounds in the 90s, on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog. This was that period of radio enthusiasm. There were even women who later confessed to being on the network and communicating with friends, never revealing their true identity. This was a time of amateurs and kind of think of the very, very early blogging era. As I alluded to, we forget how completely isolated people were in the country. So a lot of the most enthusiastic people lived way out in the sticks. It's a dynamic that we see again and again with new communications technologies. Over time, the range of these devices went up, so they could cover dozens of kilometers. And people also learned how to amplify the signal so that they didn't have to rely on its intrinsic, really weak energy. Wireless sets saved a bunch of lives at sea, so they became mandatory on ships, and the Navy became the natural interested party because they're very bulky, but ships had no other way to communicate, and this was an immediate kind of practical thing that use that they saw for this stuff. I want to read you an extract from a contemporary paper. This is around 1909, 1910, talking about the return of one of these naval trips to port. When the wireless telegraph operator at the Portsmouth Navy Yard tried, a week ago last Saturday, to reach the fleet that was returning from its voyage around the world, he was able to catch only a single message, and that was from the cruiser Yankton, 1,000 miles in advance of the other ships. The trouble was that the air was full of unimportant electric messages sent by young amateur operators in the region of Boston. The number of such amateurs who are experimenting with this new form of telegraphy is surprising, and their feats are interesting and picturesque. One boy, for example, in a New York suburb, has a wireless installation which is practically entirely the work of his own hands. In the evening or after school hours, he often sits at his instrument and talks with one or another of half a dozen of his friends who have similar installations, or listens at random to the messages with which the air is filled. So this is a completely familiar character to us, especially those of us who are older and grew up with the early days of the internet. You can find a lot of these on a site called earlyradiohistory.us. It has transcribed these cool, a lot of ranty editorials about how kids are ruining themselves by spending too much time on their radio hobby. The biggest difference between then and now is that people were actually praised for staying at home and living in their basement with their mothers because it meant that they weren't out on the streets having bad influences applied to them. They weren't mocked for it at all. In 1912, the Titanic sinks. And this is a huge event culturally. It's also a huge event for radio. The news of the Titanic sinking takes forever to get to the White House because everybody's trying to transmit it at the same time. There's no control over, there's no protocol over who gets to speak when. So President Taft gets very, very angry and threatens to regulate the industry. And unfortunately, 2 years later, the outbreak of World War I means that the industry is not just regulated, but it is completely shut down. Amateur radio is banned for 5 years in the United States, completely. Only the Navy is allowed to use the radio, and they start trying to buy everybody out. All of the former operators, the Navy buys their sets until Congress has to smack them down and say, this is going way too far. When the ban is lifted in 1919, there is a huge influx of interest and money, and there's just a big fad around radio. It's a lot like our dot-com bubble. The money starts pouring in, and everything is radio-themed. There's even young adult fiction. Here we have the radio boys who solve crimes and have adventures. I didn't solve many crimes as a child, and I was led to expect by all the stuff that I read that it was just normal to have adventures and catch criminals from the age of, say, 9 to 15. Never happened. I don't know how it was with you, but this continues to be a disappointment. These kids, however, every time they turn the radio on, they're solving crimes, they're traveling somewhere. Trade journals got into the mix, too. I'll go back. They talked about how all of business was going to be transformed by the arrival of radio. One example is jewelers who sold expensive watches. You can't sell someone a $1,000 watch unless you're Apple without the time being completely correct. So the jewelers actually leased telegraph lines that were very expensive so that they could get the daily time signal from the Naval Observatory and set the watches just so. And there's an entire article in the jewelry trade press that explains what the luminiferous ether is, how to build your radio set, how to tune it so that you can get the much cheaper radio signal from Annapolis. And these things, example after example, piled on of how radio was going to revolutionize stuff. An interesting thing about this period is that it wasn't obvious that broadcasting would even be a thing. We think of radio as naturally as a broadcast medium now, but it was still in its infancy, and it was a point-to-point kind of communication where you found someone to talk to and you picked a frequency. And even the people who were doing broadcasting were like the early bloggers. It was very low power and quirky, and they would just pick a time and their friends would listen to them. One of the earliest broadcasts was this fight with Jack Dempsey, where they set up an entire apparatus. One person would narrate the fight, who was an experienced professional, and then they had amateurs all up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States who were listening to it. Some of them would rent a room like this one and pay admission and set up big amplifying horns so that they could hear the signal over the radio. It took weeks to set up just a single broadcast because everybody had to know what frequency they'd be on and what their job was. But very quickly, the industry professionalized, and the government banned broadcasting by amateurs. It became a strictly professional thing, and you got to a point where radio is an endeavor, much like now, we're specializing in the web. You had specialists in the technology, you had specialists in broadcasting. So the mass market radio meant you had to get licenses, you had to have a budget, and big business began to take over. Within a few years, you had monopolies running the American radio networks to the point where they had to be broken up. This is back when we still actually broke up monopolies and didn't just let them continue. So the industry, which initially had been run on this mix of government money and just by hobbyists who loved what they were doing, finds its way also to a workable business model, which was advertising. And they had to fight a lot of wars around copyright because copyright law was not set up for broadcasting for profit over the airwaves. It just hadn't occurred to people. So again, echoes of the early web very much. Now, it doesn't take long in this situation where there's a mass market new medium for talented people to discover how they can use radio for political purposes. One of these very early pioneers in the United States is this priest named Father Coughlin. He's a Catholic and an early religious broadcaster who discovers that when he starts ranting about politics in a very angry way, his audience goes up. So he kind of specializes in that. By the middle of the 1930s, he has an active audience of 10 million people. He rails against bankers and international conspiracies and the Jews, very much like a certain politician in the United States today. His rhetoric is actually eerily similar to this kind of populist rabble-rousing. I'm going to play you a little bit of what he sounds like.
The word war vibrates. Of what do we speak when we utter that word war? Blaring bands, martial airs, gaudy uniforms, ringing cheers, the riddle marching feet, the glint of sunlight and shining bayonets and polished.
So you sit and you listen to this shit hour after hour all day. It has an effect. He was a very, very good broadcaster. He met his match, though, in the other great political radio talent in America, who was the president, Franklin Roosevelt, who when he came into office at the start of the Depression, he faced a hostile press that was controlled by his opponents. He came up with the idea of doing these fireside chats. They were radio broadcasts that were meant to be intimate. It was as if he was sitting in your parlor in the evening, explaining why the country was collapsing around you. So let's listen to FDR for a second.
To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be.
So you wouldn't think that someone talking to you about the banking system would be riveting listening, but in this atmosphere of crisis, people ate it up. They were hearing directly from their elected leader in his own words about an issue that they found terrifying and that he explained in human terms. The fireside chats won Roosevelt this lasting popularity to the point where he was elected 4 times to the presidency. Saul Bellow writes about what it was like to experience this as a listener in a public space. Drivers had pulled over, parking bumper to bumper, and turned on their radios to hear Roosevelt. They had rolled down the windows and opened the car doors. Everywhere the same voice, its odd Eastern accent, which in anyone else would have irritated Midwesterners. You could follow without missing a single word as you strolled by. You felt joined to these unknown drivers, men and women smoking their cigarettes in silence, not so much considering the president's words as affirming the rightness of his tone and taking assurance from it. And right here already you have this warning about how the medium of radio could be used to manipulate. That thing about not considering his words but just affirming. That was the strange power that radio had over emotions, to persuade people through repetition, through familiarity, through tone, to make you feel part of a group even as you listen to it by yourself. Europe also had its radio genius. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, one of his first acts after the Nazis took power in 1933 was to start the production of cheap radios, the Volksempfänger, or people's receiver. Goebbels thought it was essential for people to have a radio in the home and have loudspeakers at their workplace so that they could hear the steady drumbeat of official propaganda. At the same time that the radio was changing the political scene, it was also revolutionizing the mechanics of war as we built towards war in the 1930s. Radio gave armies what they had lacked in World War I, a way to communicate in the field during the action. Armies in World War I had been paralyzed partly because whenever they started an offensive, they would immediately lose contact with forward units. There was no way, you had to plan everything in advance. World War II, of course, was different. When we think about World War II, we think about tanks and blitzkrieg, but an essential part of what made the German armies so fearsome, especially in the first 2 years of the war, was that every one of those tanks had a radio unit and it had soldiers who were trained to use it. So radio was kind of the star, technologically speaking, of the Second World War, whether used as a weapon or as a propaganda tool. And when he was tried after the war, Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and kind of groomed successor, said this: Hitler's dictatorship differed in one fundamental point from all its predecessors in history. His was the first that made complete use of technical means for domination of its own country. Through technical devices like the radio and loudspeaker, 80 million people were deprived of independent thought. Well, that's a pretty convenient thing for Albert Speer to think, since he was on trial for his life, that radio deprives you of independent thought. But there was something to the claim. Something about not having full personal agency, this powerful emotional force that comes into your home and is different than anything that had taken place before. I want you to notice that it took less than 3 decades for radio to go and make this transition from just kind of a far-off toy of hobbyists to big business to where it occupied center stage, politically speaking. To the inventors and early adopters of this technology, it was a hard blow to take. When it was born, radio technology seemed like it could only be a force for good. It's very hard to imagine how something that brings people together and lets them communicate could ever be bad. Radio brought music into hospitals and nursing homes. It eased the loneliness of living on a farm. It let people hear directly from their elected representatives. It brought world-class music into your sitting room. It brought you weather forecasts for the first time. It saved lives at sea. How could this technology possibly be bad? But again, these radio waves are just oscillating little magnetic and electric fields. They don't care about us, our values. All they want to do is go at the speed of light. The idea that it's very hard to accept for us is that good people who are working on technology with good intentions and trying to benefit everyone can end up building something that gets used for evil. This is not a photograph, not a real photograph. It's a still from a movie called Hate Radio, but it's based on what happened during the Rwandan genocide in 1994, where one radio station called Radio-Télévision Libre des Mille Collines in Rwanda played a pivotal role in organizing and instigating murder. Harvard researchers have somehow estimated that 50,000 of the deaths in that genocide, about 10%, can be attributed more or less directly to what was done at the radio station. And the radio station didn't just broadcast hate speech, it broadcast this kind of mix of wacky comedy and good dance music and hate speech. And it accumulated, and it had its effect. It's no accident that whenever there's a coup, the first thing the rebels seize is the radio station. Technology, interacts in with human nature in these complicated ways. And part of human nature is simply bad. People want to dominate other people, they want to manipulate other people, and they're smart and they will find ways to use technology to do these things. And we can't assume that the technologies that we build and develop and invent are going to be any different than technologies that came before, that they're not going to be adopted in the same ways. There's always this gap between the time there's mass adoption of a new medium and when someone really figures out how to use it in its native form. It's possible that people like Putin, people like Trump, people like the Brexit organizers are the new geniuses of social media, for example, and targeting and machine learning. But I worry that they're not, that they're just the beginners, and that we haven't even seen what it's like when someone with a real talent for this new medium figures out how to use it effectively towards political ends. And I think when we're not taking the threat seriously enough. Last week, Google had a conference called Google I/O. Did anybody watch this? There was a lot of amazing stuff there, like augmented reality, every type of AI and every type of device. The one thing, and the theme of this conference is that we're going to put artificial intelligence everywhere we possibly can and give you the tools that we've developed so you can do cool things with it too, and you're going to show us what amazing things are possible. The one thing that nobody mentioned at the conference was what Google actually makes its living doing. In order to train this artificial intelligence and in order to fund all of this enterprise, Google conducts the greatest program of mass surveillance in human history. It's significant to me that none of the companies that live off of surveillance, that make their money off of ads, are comfortable talking about their business model openly. You don't always get a clear signal whether what you're working on is good or bad for the world. All right? They don't call it like OK Goebbels and put a swastika on top so you know you're building something evil. They call it OK Google. But you can get hints. I bet even the people that worked on that People's Radio in Germany, that was a cool technical project, and it was kind of altruistic. Let's make a cheap radio for the masses. It seems like a good idea. But I think that being ashamed of your own business model is a pretty big red flag that you're not working on something that's good for the world. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes has this to say about mass surveillance. Do not revile the king even in your thoughts, or curse the rich in your bedroom, because a bird in the sky may carry away your words, and a bird on the wing may report what you say. Our life now is full of these birds on the wing. Our radios don't just talk to us anymore, they also listen and they learn, and they know how to whisper algorithmically into our ears to give us targeted messages that they know we're going to find persuasive. It's a scary world that we're building, and I don't think that we have to build it this way. There's nothing inevitable about the business models we've chosen to run the internet on. We can't unbuild the network, but we can certainly decide that we're not going to pay for it by spying on each other. I know that you're not here to listen to a political talk, but I'm giving it to you anyway because I think the work you do and the choice of who to work for and what to work on matters a lot. I poked fun at you earlier for caring so much about your tools and having so many of them. I want to be sure that you also care as much about the broader impact that everything you do has during this moment of change and when things are crystallizing, when we're seeing what direction the online world is going to take. I'm in Poland, so I have to not only try to end on a happier note than that, but talk about one of my favorite radio stories. For people who aren't from Poland, don't speak Polish, this is a famous photo. The movie playing is Apocalypse Now at the Moscow Theater, And this is right after the declaration of martial law in 1981, when the Solidarity Union was suppressed and the military took over the country. It was a time of fear. How many of you lived through that time here? A couple of old-timers. I was detained by accident in America because I'm a procrastinator, so we never made it home. But I remember watching it on the news. Has anybody heard of Jan Hanasz and the radio astronomers in Toruń? Okay, good. Then I have an anecdote for you. So there's a bunch of radio astronomers in the city of Toruń who decide in the autumn of 1982 that they've had enough and they want to do something. Jan Hanasz is also the guy who runs the local chapter of Solidarity, which is deep underground, and they decide that they're going to do an illegal radio broadcast. People had done these in Warsaw from the rooftops, but that proved kind of clunky because you could triangulate that very quickly, and the security services were good at finding the rooftop broadcasters. So one of these big radio astronomy nerds calculates how much coverage you could get if you put a radio on a balloon and just floated it over. And it turns out to be a surprisingly high number. It's something like 20 or 40 kilometers, even with a low-power transmitter. So that gets them to thinking. Now, they think about using a weather balloon, but those are too easy to trace. There's not a lot of weather balloons. What they do know they can use is beach balls. You can buy beach balls in any sporting goods store at the time, and a friend of theirs from a lab gives them some hydrogen. They keep the hydrogen in a fire extinguisher. This is why there are Polish jokes. I like to imagine that they pranked each other with a fire extinguisher full of hydrogen, saying, hey, Jacek, your cigarette, let me put it out for you. Or, that someone started a fire in a wastebasket just to see what would happen. But they survived this, obviously, and got the balloon part of the experiment set up fine. Another colleague of theirs figured out how to make a little antenna out of copper foil so that they could have a decent range on the thing. The hardest part that proved to get was the actual tape deck, so that you could play your Solidarity tape when the balloon was in the air. And the reason wasn't because the Polish government oppressed them, it was because the American government had embargoed advanced electronics, so you couldn't buy this stuff in the Eastern Bloc. Luckily, there was a French colleague who smuggled these used tape decks back into Poland for them, and they disassembled them to make them as light as possible, and started launching these balloons over the city of Toruń. Hanasz describes it like this in an interview. The underground press would announce broadcasts in advance. Sometimes they pasted flyers on walls. People knew to scan the UHF band at a certain hour. We didn't announce a specific frequency range so that there wouldn't be interference. The broadcast would start with a long call signal. This is Radio Solidarity Toruń. People needed time to tune their radios. Then there would be 15 minutes or so of programming, when the limiting factor being battery life. It was a really safe undertaking. Nobody got caught. The Security Bureau guys knew about the broadcast in advance because of our flyers, and radio direction finding vans would rove around the city, but they could never pinpoint the transmitter. We were able to watch them search. Once they even wound up on the banks of the Vistula, completely lost. The helplessness of the Security Bureau brought laughter and satisfaction to people who were tired of the repression of martial law. In 1982, there were 11 clandestine Radio Solidarity radio stations that were shut down across Poland. These scientists who cooperated in the balloon project were putting their careers on the line, and they were risking serious jail time as well. And the act of defiance that they performed, it didn't bring down the state or do much of anything. All it did was give hope and brighten the lives of a few hundred people that caught it, but that is a lot to do in those circumstances. And what they did, to me, goes straight back to that first idealistic promise of radio, that there were these magic invisible rays that have the power to erase the distance between people, that can penetrate barriers, that can go through even the thickest wall. And I tell this story to reassure you that just because I'm asking you to think in political terms and think about your political role, doesn't mean you have to stop being a nerd. We can nerd out as much as we want. The utopian qualities that made us love the web to begin with, they haven't disappeared, even though it's become more centralized and more commercial and commoditized, and we can still find ways to defend and express them in our work today. The thing I call on you to recognize is that there is a fight. There's a need for these individual acts of creative resilience. We have to make sure that the powerful don't get comfortable using our tools. We have to broaden our industry and bring in people with very different life experience so we can learn from them directly as people and not try to understand them through algorithms. And we have to find ways to dismantle the surveillance economy that puts so many people at risk. I want to leave you with a final quote from Ecclesiastes. This is a light, sunny quote that I think would be perfect for example, a graduation speech. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. For there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest. I hope that your journey to the grave is long and enjoyable. I especially hope that you all find work to do that in later years you can turn back and look on with satisfaction. You're the pioneers in a field that is changing the world, whether for good or for bad, we don't know yet, but we do know that it's changing. So the decisions that you make matter. Please think about that in the weeks and months to come, not just as tech workers, but as citizens and as fellow human beings. And thank you so much for listening to me rant at you today.